So today we're going to talk about legislative landmarks in special education. So there's really three main laws that have governed the treatment of students with disabilities that really affect students today in schools. And one is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. The second is the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And the third is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time and kind of talk through all three, as all three have greatly changed the lives of people with disabilities and have really taken us out of the constitutional arguments for why we have to treat people with disability as we treat other people in the community to actually providing additional protections for people with disabilities. So the Individuals with Disability Education Act was originally passed by Congress in 1975, and it was called the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. And then in 1990, it was renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. There's been some other reauthorizations, and with each one comes some new rules, and we have to kind of figure out what's now included and what and how protections for people with disabilities, for kids in schools in particular, have been further defined. So like in '89, there was a reauthorization to include preschool and then down to infants and toddlers. We realized from 1975 that it seemed kind of silly that there were no services provided until the student was got into first grade, and so Congress extended funding down to preschool, and then there's an incentive program for states that do a birth to two service model for kids who clearly are at risk for developing disabilities. And then there were also some significant amendments added in 97 and 2004. So the Individuals with Disability Education Act, or what you'll always refer to from here on out as IDEA, there's 6 major principles that have really stood the test of time since the first authorization of the law, and they've stayed pretty consistent and just been further defined in each reauthorization up to today. So the first principle is zero reject, and what that's about is that schools must educate all students with disabilities. So you can't exclude students with disabilities or exclude children based on behaviors that are part of their disability. And we could see before IDEA that there was a lot of schools, a lot of public educational schools that were denying students access based on the fact that they had a disability. So some would argue that the students' disabilities were too profound and they could not provide adequate educational services, so they denied them access. In other situations, schools said, well, students' behavior is too extreme, that they cannot be served in public education. And so what this principle really makes very, very clear is that schools can't just deny students access to public education or public education plans or programs strictly based on their disability. So the second principle is non-discrimination, identification, and evaluation. And what this really gets at is that schools must use non-biased, multi-factored methods for evaluation. So schools can't use, well, first of all, they have to use multiple measures for evaluation. You can't just give students one test or do one evaluation and then say definitively the student has or doesn't have a particular disability. So you have to use multiple measures. The other thing is that those multiple measures have to be vetted and and both be determined to be both reliable and valid in their in what they're measuring. So you can't use one of these internet IQ assessments that you see online, or at Barnes and Noble you can get these quick little test your IQ little quick tests, or if you sign up for if you want to become a member of Mensa, they have these kind of quick little measures or something like that that are supposed to give you an idea of kind of what your aptitude or what your IQ is, and for special education, particularly for determining services, you can't use any of those those tools because they're not reliable and they're not valid. So there's a handful of psychological assessments that have been shown to be very reliable and arguably valid in determining what is, whatever the construct of IQ is. They're at least reliable in determining kind of what that is. And we have the same thing for achievement tests, that you can't use some sort of group achievement test and then be able to use those results to either qualify or deny a student access to special education. We have individualized tests that have to be administered by somebody who has been trained and is qualified to give those particular assessments. They have to be normed on a very large population of students. And even though the individual questions sometimes don't make a lot of sense when you pull them out individually, they've been given to, usually thousands of students. And we use those assessments for determining eligibility, not some sort of, cheap homemade assessments or something like that somebody came up with. The other thing is that they have to, because they're also, we also can't discriminate based on people, so they have to be non-biased. And so we can't administer particular assessments that may have been created and normed on people whose first language is English and give those, use those assessments to determine eligibility for folks where English was not their first language. And so we also have to make sure to be aware of that. So many of these assessments, you can, school psychologists can make the determination that there are some that are normed for English, and other languages also have these norm tests. Now, the challenge that sometimes we run into is that not all districts may have access to someone who's qualified to give particular assessments in particular languages. And as we see the number of languages spoken where students are, where English was not their first or their primary language, it oftentimes provides an extra challenge for students and for schools to make sure that their assessment measures are non-biased. So, but the principle behind it and what we're always striving for is to make sure that when we're identifying students from special education, we want to make sure that we're using non-biased identification and evaluation. The challenge is that sometimes we're so worried about including students where English isn't their first language into special education that we sometimes make the mistake of excluding students that probably should have qualified, that actually do have a disability, but we're excluding them based on the fact that English was not their first language. And so it's a difficult problem because you want to oftentimes get students the services that they need in order to be able to benefit, but we have this long history of over-identifying students where English wasn't their first language, or we also see this with individuals in the deaf community where people are receiving services or there's this assumption made about students' language just because they're able to communicate, because of their ability to communicate in a second language. So the third principle of IDEA is free, appropriate public education. And what this really gets down to is that we cannot expect from parents or from students anything that we wouldn't expect from a general education student. So again, there's this long history of placing undue burdens and responsibilities on parents of children with disabilities, saying that they have to provide either particular materials so that students can access education, or they have to provide transportation, or they've got to provide extra materials, or there's certain technologies or things that a student needs, that it places an undue burden on parents. And what free appropriate public education is that it just that schools come up with an individualized plan for students, And whatever that student needs to succeed, to be able to have a free, appropriate public education, has to be listed in that plan. So if a school decides that a student needs a audio recorder, then the school is going to be obliged to make sure that that student has an audio recorder. If in that IEP it lists that a student is going to use for like a live scribe pen or some other sort of assistive or technology or something like that, then it's the school that's responsible for providing those particular items or whatever's needed so that the student can access public education. And so the next principle is least restrictive environment. And so the least restrictive environment for all students is full-time and general education. But we understand that that isn't always possible for particular students with disabilities, and that so where we're left is that when we're looking at placing students in education, we always want to start with what would it look like if they were receiving all of their services in general education. But we need to make sure that we're educating children without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate in those general education settings. So we'll talk about in another module about what that looks like and how you make a determination of what is the least restrictive environment, and how that what's the even though the least restrictive environment is general education, when might we have to choose that the full-time and general education is not meeting the needs of that particular student, and we'll look at that. There's also a principle of due process safeguards, and what this allows is that the parent and the student have rights that exceed those of students in general education when it comes to disagreements with the school. So in public education, most general education students, if they have a problem with the school, they would have to go out and get an attorney and engage in whatever the legal fight would be that a parent would want to pursue in order to if they feel that a student's rights have been violated in school. For students with special needs, because there's heightened scrutiny for abuse by school districts of students' individual rights, there is a kind of a shortened legal process that makes that tries to level the playing field between for parents, that when they feel like their students' rights have been violated, there's an expedited kind of legal system that schools are able to go to and parents are able to go to reach resolution. And the book does a better job about kind of talking about some of these timelines, but we've got to remember that in our history, what oftentimes happened is that parents would complain that their students' rights weren't being obligated, and districts would say, "Oh well," and not provide services. And then it would oftentimes take, as is the case with our legal system, it would take several years for these questions to kind of get answered. And what we found was that really wasn't meeting the needs of students. And so there is this kind of separate from the or kind of parallel to our kind of traditional legal system, these other due process protections and safeguards that parents are able to access to make sure that students' rights aren't being violated. And then we also have this concept of shared decision making, and that in that when schools are developing individualized education plans, they must also really collaborate with the parents, and that the parents' desires and wishes for their child need to be considered in developing educational programming. And this is something that we really don't see in public education, where where parents actually have a right to participate and to have a voice in how education is in the educational plans for their children. And so this is something that is really unique in special education, that they are supposed to have an equal voice in sharing their thoughts and their dreams and moving down to even particular objectives that they want their students to, their children to be working on in that particular year. So as I mentioned earlier, we've increased special education to not just be for school age, but there are also services provided from birth to through kindergarten. So that doesn't really affect you all that much, but it's just important to know that when we have children who clearly may have disabilities later on in life, we want to try to catch students as soon as we can and provide early intervention services. Okay, so part of the IEP, or the Individualized Education Plan, also requires that the school provide related services and assistive technology. So schools are required to provide any related service, and that can include counseling or psychological services or OT, occupational therapy, or PT, physical therapy, vision, parent training, speech therapy, medical services, transportation. I mean, there's a whole list of services that, if indeed that these services are needed in order for the student to meet their individualized education plan, it's the district that's ultimately responsible to make sure that those services and that includes technologies we'll talk about in a minute, are in place. So when IEPs are written, districts have to be, upper district level administration is usually wants to be informed as to if the IEP team is planning on including additional services or additional therapies as part of the IEP, because at the end of the day, they're really responsible for providing those services. Or in different states, they have different ways of who pays for kind of what services, but the school is obligated to help them kind of facilitate and organize those services listed in the IEP. So it also includes assistive technology. So if the school says that it would be great for the student to have a calculator, then the school has to provide the calculator. If for students with more severe disabilities or significant disabilities, we may see that this may include visual aids, or could be iPads or other forms of where we've got technology now that provides augmentative communication devices. So things like, if you've seen Stephen Hawking's talk through his, he used to use a Liberator, but you'll see these devices, these voice output devices, if the school determines that those technologies are needed in order for a student to access and to meet the needs of their individualized education plan, then the school is on the hook for those costs and repair and those kind of issues as well. So that doesn't mean, though, that there isn't still much debate about what services are necessary and reasonable to require for a district. You'll see that oftentimes this is where we end up talking about the concept of kind of free appropriate public education, and that, is this device really needed, or is there some other device that would provide maybe not the best, but an adequate level of service for students. So for students with disabilities, you also have additional restrictions in place for suspension and expulsion, or any sort of discipline, really. So even if a school has a school policy around discipline, it's the obligation of the school to make sure that they're not violating a student's rights. And so how that oftentimes looks is that if you have a student who has a disability, and an aspect of their disability is that they may have some behavior problems, then you can't deny a student access to education based on a product or based on a component of their disability. And so starting in 97, we have this concept of a manifestation determination. And what that really is it's it's a decision that's made kind of within the school, an analysis of the situation, of a disciplinary situation. And if the school seeks to change some sort of placement or suspend a student or expel a student in excess of 10 school days, then the IEP team and other qualified personnel must review the relationship between the student's misconduct and the student's disability. And if it's determined that the student's misconduct is not related to the student's disability, then the student can be disciplined in the same manner that we typically see in schools. With one exception, that the school districts must continue to provide educational services in an alternate placement. So this one I think is oftentimes really hard for teachers to get their head around. They're like, well, wait, shouldn't everybody be treated equal? If the school has a policy that if you punch somebody, that means that you get a week suspension. Why do people with disabilities have greater protections? And again, what it really comes down to is this concept of, there are a lot of disabilities that are more that are visual, and there are some disabilities that are more invisible. And so when we look at students who have more invisible disabilities, like students with behavior problems or students with learning problems, we have to make sure that we're not violating their constitutional rights to a free, appropriate public education. So one way I kind of think about it is that if you can't punish a student, say, who's in a wheelchair, if the school doesn't have a ramp so that they can actually access the school building and access their classes. Nobody's going to say, well, you just need to try harder or try to walk better. And it's the same way with behavior when we look at students where behavior is a component of their disability, is that you can't expect someone's behavior and provide discipline for it if in fact that student's behavior is part of their disability. So again, we can't discriminate against anyone based on their disability. It doesn't matter what aspect or kind of what their disability is. Now that doesn't mean that students who are violent are necessarily going to be receiving services in the general education population. But what it means is that we may have to find an alternate placement or a more appropriate placement for them to receive educational services. And whether that's in their local school or whether that's in a more restrictive placement, that's for the IEP team to decide. So a law that actually preceded IDEA that greatly enhanced the lives and the ability for people with disabilities to participate in public education, and actually pretty much education in general, is usually just referred to as Section 504, but its proper name is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So what that law does is it extends civil rights to people with disabilities. So we don't have to now make these constitutional arguments anymore. We can just, the law makes it very clear that there are civil rights that people with disabilities can access. So originally the law was targeting programs dealing with employment and enhancements of employment for people with disabilities. You got to remember too that during this time we had a number of veterans returning from Vietnam who were seeking employment, having difficulties, and also had disabilities. And we wanted to make sure that people with disabilities were not being discriminated against in employment. But what the law also does is extends protections to students with disabilities seeking to access federal supported public schools. Now, federally supported public schools, you think, well, the public schools, the federal government doesn't really support public schools. It's not that the federal government, directly funds or supports kind of local education. That's usually a state's right. But support is the important word here. So any school that receives any sort of federal funds or federal programs is required to provide the protections of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So that includes all colleges and universities, because all colleges and universities, or all colleges and universities I know of, accept student financial aid from the federal government to to provide educational services. So they all have to provide uh, equal access, and that also, of course, includes then K-12 as well. So what's interesting with this law is that it is not as restrictive on its definition of disability as IDEA. So IDEA has this very strict, this very rigid number of categories that a student has to meet one of those categories in order to receive services for special education. Section 504 isn't nearly as limited. It just extends rights to people with disabilities, and it's not this very, very small 10% of the population group. So a lot of students who have, for example, ADD or ADHD that don't qualify for special education still have some rights under Section 504. So it also includes folks with mental health issues, students who earlier on, a lot of it had to do with access, where we used Section 504 before the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed to try to make sure that that students could actually access classes and programs as well. So again, this is written during a time where a lot of civil rights legislation was being written and being enacted, and so this law really takes on a lot of that kind of civil rights language that we see. That's a little different than what we see in IDEA, looking at providing protections. So some other kind of restrictions on Section 504 is that IDEA funds cannot be used to meet Section 504 requirements. So, and this is very important for schools in that you have some students who are receiving services under Section 504, but you've got a smaller group of students that may be receiving services under special education, and you can't use special education money to fund Section 504. So usually every building has, and certainly every district has kind of a person who's in charge of the 504 plans, and that can't be someone who's being paid using money for special education. So it's someone different. And individuals come up with Section 504 plans, and if you haven't seen a lot of IEPs or Section 504 plans, it would be very hard to tell them apart because both kind of list what are some obligations that the university or that the school has, and some accommodations that the school must provide so that students can succeed in school. So again, some of the requirements for schools under Section 504 is that schools need to undertake efforts to identify and locate students with disabilities. They have to provide a free and appropriate education for students with disabilities. Again, you see the same kind of language passing through these different laws. Also, students need to have physical accessibility to all programs. So, this is a really tough one it's not as big of an issue now, but it was a big issue years ago where, now we don't even notice when doorways are a little bit wider so that they can be more easily accessed from people in wheelchairs, or we don't notice the automatic door openings, the little blue buttons that you hit to open heavy doors. But you got to understand that 15, 20 years ago, these were this was just really shocking. People just didn't people weren't used to all these changes that schools had to kind of provide. In fact, a good example I can think of is that that I remember there was a student in a wheelchair when I went to undergrad who the only way for her to get into the student union, this was at Gonzaga, was they used a retrofit uh, a wheelchair elevator for her, and the place they put it wasn't up front where everybody else walked through the front doors, and you had to go up several stairs and then enter through the front door. No, they kind of retrofitted it with this little elevator, but it was right next to the dumpster for the meal service cafeteria. And so a couple times I went up the elevator. I went up kind of, you'd walk behind there, and especially in the summer in Spokane, you could smell it from quite a distance. But that also too, as people would throw things into the dumpster, a lot of the garbage would end up on the elevator for students who use wheelchairs. And so a lot of that kind of stuff we just don't see as much anymore, because as buildings have been forced to remodel, and we'll talk about this more with IDEA, we've made sure that making accessible entrances just doesn't seem like that big of a deal anymore. Where years ago it was a very big deal, and people just didn't have this mindset. They weren't used to seeing things such as ramps and how people often complain that these providing these services were not aesthetically pleasant, and how can a ramp look pleasant in architecture, and so there's a lot of these kind of debates, but we just don't see as much of that anymore. People have just kind of gotten over it. Most of us don't even realize when we're going through a door that's just a little bit wider, as the codes changed for particular buildings or retrofits for remodels. But this also includes, and we've got to be aware too that this law also covers all programs. And so, years ago, this was a big deal when we were looking at how do you accommodate students with disabilities into some academic programs. And so there was a lot of debate at the time, and schools have to have and programs have to have very specific language that doesn't discriminate against people with disabilities, but they can have specific language as to what skills folks need in order to complete certain skills. So like medical schools are a good example that, some have very specific language about what kind of skills a person has to be able to do in order to be able to go to medical school. So, and we see the same thing with other educational and other kind of job opportunities that we see, and that jobs are really specific now in listing what are the requirements for this particular job. And we'll get into this more kind of in the ADA, because that also is covered, covers these kind of issues. But you just can't openly discriminate against people with disabilities. You have to give them at least an option to describe and to how they're going to be able to complete the job. You just can't discriminate against them outright. And this also includes extracurricular and non-academic activities that are included in Section 504. So it's not just your academic programs, but are your extracurricular programs accessible and for students with disabilities? Now, with there are some limits when we look at kind of access to certain sports, and I think that certainly by now most schools have gone through a pretty rigorous method of kind of looking at what are the kind of the critical components of play and extracurricular activities that need to be included and need not to, and some of these are still being determined. So a good example of this, it's probably a few years ago now, there was a pro golf a golf pro who was entering into the pro circuit, and in pro golf you have to walk the course. You can't ride around in a golf cart. And there was a student, I believe he was from Stanford University, who ended up going through the courts, challenging that in college, because he had a disability, he was able to use a golf cart in order to get from hole to hole. But what the PGA was saying at the time is that being able to walk the course was a part of the game, and that it could put this person at an advantage that we wouldn't, and so they denied him access to using a golf cart, and that case actually went through the courts. So you've got to remember too that now that had to do with professional athletics, but you can see where both during high school and during college, he could use a golf cart, even though that wasn't typically allowed for his non-disabled peers in golf. And also, Section 504 requires non-discriminatory evaluation. Now, the challenge with Section 504 is that it's the obligation of the person to pay for the evaluation. There's not, schools and employers can require documentation of a disability, but it's the person's obligation to provide that adequate documentation. And so that's oftentimes where we see some particular challenges, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Oh, sorry, there's also procedural safeguards in place with least restrictive environments as well. Okay, so with Section 504, all students who qualify under IDEA also receive protection under Section 504. However, not all 504 students qualify for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So students under 504 who do not qualify for IDEA need a 504 plan, or it's also called an accommodation plan, to receive services. And again, it looks very similar to a IEP, but it's we're using a different law to provide those accommodations. So when we first started on the first lecture, we talked a bit about how exceptional children, that term refers to folks both at the upper end of the educational spectrum as well as those that are falling significantly behind their peers. There is actually a law that governs and provides some financial incentives for states to develop gifted and talented programs, and it's called the Gifted and Talented Children's Education Act. And what it does is it provides some financial incentives for states to develop programs for students, but the law is not a mandate like IDEA is. It only provides some money for states that provide services. And so what you see is that services for students that qualify as gifted and talented are varied from district to district, and certainly from state to state. And so even how students qualify and how states determine, or how districts determine who and what students are actually gifted and talented is as varied as the districts and states that are providing the service. And so, I think once again, even in a population that most people would really like to see enhanced in schools, unless the federal government kind of comes in and says, no, you have to provide appropriate education for this particular population, districts and states don't provide the motivation for districts to actually provide those services. So again, there are some grant programs, and there are some great programs out there that provide services for kids who are gifted and talented, but there's no mandate to provide such services. So the final law that I want to talk about is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was signed into law in 1990. And what it does is it extends civil rights protections to private sector employment, all public services, public accommodations, transportation, and communications. So some of the provisions under the Act is that employers with 15 or more employees may not refuse to hire or promote a person with a disability due to their disability if the person is qualified for the job. So the employer must also make reasonable accommodations, and accommodations cannot cause undue hardship for the employer, but they have to make reasonable accommodations if requested by the employee that will allow the person to perform the essential functions of that job. So what this provision actually kind of provides is that, again, once you've hit that 15 employee threshold, it is all up to the employee to make those the request for accommodations, and then the employer and the person with the disability negotiate as to what those accommodations are and what that kind of looks like. So a lot of these now are just so common we don't even think about them as disability accommodations. So for example, folks with back injuries now, it's really not uncommon around work to see people with sit-stand desks, or to have different types of chairs in their offices, and even though it's quite common, years ago those were people just didn't think that those kind of accommodations could be manageable for for employers. Other things that you see now that you didn't necessarily see years ago was employers have done a much better job of actually listing what are the actual requirements for the job. So if a person has to drive, then that's oftentimes listed in the job description. If a person has to be able to, if the job actually requires that a person has to be able to lift a certain amount of weight, that has to be specifically listed in that job description. So the job descriptions have to be specific enough so that and have to be clear as to what are the skills that the person actually needs to do the job. So where this becomes a problem is when employers provide accommodations for some people, but then choose not to provide accommodations for others. So, for example, when I was in high school, I worked at McDonald's, and there was a woman there who ran the parties, and everybody called her Grandma, which was I don't know if she liked that or not. It seems a little pejorative right now, but anyway, that was what she did, and she ran the parties. And so she was a hostess and would run the little kid birthday parties and do some other things. So Grandma didn't get assigned, and I wish I knew what the woman's name was now, because it just is sounding more and more offensive the more I talk about it. She wasn't responsible to do things like unload the truck at 5 in the morning. So there were, for other people who worked in the mornings, they oftentimes one of the job responsibilities was to go out to the both cold and dry storage and pull boxes off the truck when a delivery came. And so so here's the challenge for employers is that nobody would have ever required Grandma to go and to unload truck at 5 o'clock in the morning. I mean, that just wouldn't have been, she was never scheduled to do it. She was I don't know whether or not she had the physical ability to move those boxes, but certainly nobody kind of required it. And so the challenge for employers is that if they are making such accommodations for one employee and they choose not to accommodate then another employee because, and that person has a disability, then that employer is really setting themselves up for the possibility of a discrimination lawsuit. So if you're willing to make an accommodation for one employee, you have to be willing to make kind of the same accommodation for another employee if that person has a disability. So I want you to think about that a little bit, kind of with particular jobs and how things how things go. In that when we make we can't treat people differently just because we like certain people more, or because again, that's really a form of discrimination. If it's something that we're willing to do to accommodate grandma, who was I assume a 68-year-old, or she might have been a little younger, woman who was working at McDonald's, then we have to make sure that we're willing to make that accommodation for everybody. We see this oftentimes in other issues that have to do with health. So when I worked at the hospital, sometimes we would see employers who would grant additional medical leave or additional medical time for folks who, say, maybe had a heart attack. But then if another one of the employees had a medical need to stay in, let's say, a psychiatric center, or receive other services, oftentimes an employer would say, oh gosh, well, we're not going to let them return to work. And so if you allow somebody time off for one medical excuse, you have to provide that same opportunity then for other people, and you can't discriminate based on one medical accommodation versus another. So you can see where that really is. The employer is really making a decision at that point that we value, or we have more, we value one particular disability, or we'll provide an accommodations for one employee, but then we're choosing not to provide that same accommodation for other folks. So employers have to be very, very careful. And those of us in schools also have to be very, very careful when we look at kind of providing, these reasonable accommodations when we're making decisions based on individual people and not over what the specific request is. ADA also requires that public transportation be accessible. So again, this is not a big deal now, but we're used to seeing buses now that can lower themselves so that people don't have to climb up as high to get on a bus. A certain amount of all bus services have to have must have access for people with disabilities to be able to use public transportation. Now that doesn't mean that people with disabilities have to access all forms of public transportation. There are, we see in some situations where they'll run smaller, accessible buses to provide transportation for people that are served in their area or in their county. So it's quite common that if you have someone who's elderly and has a disability, they can call up their public transportation system and say, I have a disability and I need to go from here to here, and they'll send a small bus or something like that to come and take the person from one location to another. And in some some counties, you actually see that this has become so popular that they've actually extended it to people without disabilities. So for example, in Skagit County, it's called SCAT, I think. The public transportation services that are provided, any person can call up can call up the bus company, and they will send a small bus out and pick up that person at that location and then take them to the nearest terminal or bus connection so that they can get on the regular bus line. So what they found is that it actually, you don't have to worry so much about whether or not just a particular person has a disability, but they'll provide that service for everyone. And you see that some other, Skagit County isn't alone in starting to figure out that, as we have an aging population, that some of these things that we used to traditionally restrict just to for people with disabilities, that it's actually good business to increase those and provide access to everyone. It's also illegal for public accommodations such as grocery stores, restaurants, or hotels to exclude or refuse people with disabilities, and so that doesn't mean that all restaurants and hotels and grocery stores are necessarily accessible. It doesn't provide, but certainly newer ones, or ones that have had major renovations since the 90s, have to follow building codes to be accessible for people with disabilities. And so, most businesses provide some education for employees as to how to interact with people with disabilities in such a way that folks aren't offended, and that we can provide adequate services for people, so that people don't feel, so that folks feel welcomed in in public, using public businesses. And it also provides some services for telecommunications companies. So this was a much bigger deal years ago, but back in the day, every state had to come up with a telecommunications kind of network to allow for people, particularly people with hearing impairments or who are deaf, to have relay services. And so some of you may have had some experiences if you've worked in particular businesses where every kind of telecom company has to have a way to use some sort of like what we used to call kind of TTY, or kind of relay services, where someone can call in and then someone can use a type device. So a hearing person can call, and then this person will then take that call and then transcribe it into a way that into a device for a person with disability can use. And so this is one of these areas that technology has really advanced kind of beyond what the law kind of needs. So now with text messaging, and it started actually with when pagers got to be more common, particularly two-way pagers, that these really opened up opportunities that just were for things that were just inaccessible to people, particularly folks that are deaf and hard of hearing. And now with the use of text messages, of instant messaging, a lot of these kind of relay services have very little business to do anymore, since a lot of us find that you can go through and text with someone from a particular business directly from their website, and that these things are available then to everybody, and not just people with particular disability.